In a quiet living room, a 58-year-old librarian faced her most challenging confrontation. What started as family intervention took a shocking turn when they encountered a dusty black belt from 1987. Mabel Anderson wasn't your typical small-town librarian. For 37 years, she had hidden behind cardigans, known for gentle demeanor helping children. When her family demanded she act her age, she had no idea they were walking into revelation. Mabel retrieved evidence that would resurface enemies hunting her. What began as concerned children protecting their aging mother became survival against criminals who remembered Silent Storm.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mabel Anderson straightened the antimacassar on her favorite reading chair for the third time in 10 minutes, her fingers betraying the calm expression she wore like a well-practiced mask. Through the living room window, she watched David's pristine BMW pull into her driveway, followed closely by Sarah's more modest Honda. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Family meeting, David had called it when he'd phoned that morning, his voice carrying the same tone he used in corporate boardrooms. "We need to discuss some concerns, Mom." She'd known this was coming. The sideways glances at the community center, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room. The way David's jaw tightened whenever someone mentioned her martial arts classes. They saw a 58-year-old woman embarrassing herself among people young enough to be their grandchildren. They couldn't see what she saw in the mirror some mornings. The ghost of Silent Storm, still coiled and ready beneath layers of librarian cardigans and sensible shoes. The afternoon light filtered through her lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the hardwood floors she'd refinished herself last spring. David had hired professionals for his home renovations, unable to comprehend that his mother might possess the strength and skill for such work. The same way he couldn't comprehend that the woman who'd raised him while working full-time and earning her master's degree might have hidden depths he'd never bothered to explore. David entered first, his posture rigid with purpose. At 42, he carried himself like a man accustomed to solving problems through sheer force of will and careful planning. His recent divorce had only sharpened those tendencies, turning his need for control into something approaching desperation. Mabel noticed the way his expensive suit hung slightly loose on his frame. Stress eating, or rather stress not eating, another thing he thought he could control. "Mom," he said, kissing her cheek with perfunctory affection, "thanks for making time for us." The phrase irritated her more than it should have. Making time. As if her schedule were an inconvenience to navigate rather than a life fully lived. As if the hours she spent at the library, helping struggling students and managing community programs, were somehow less valuable than his corporate meetings. Sarah followed, her social worker's training evident in the way she assessed the room's emotional temperature before speaking. "Hi, Mom. You look good." The words carried genuine warmth, but Mabel caught the underlying concern, the way Sarah's eyes lingered on the slight bruise on her forearm from Tuesday's sparring session. "Coffee's fresh," Mabel offered, gesturing toward the kitchen. "I made those ginger snaps you like." "This isn't a social call," David said, settling onto the couch with the confidence of someone preparing to deliver a presentation. Sarah shot him a warning look but took the seat beside him, her body language already apologetic. Mabel chose her reading chair, positioning herself across from them with the coffee table as neutral ground. Years of working with difficult library patrons had taught her the value of strategic positioning during confrontations. The chair also happened to be where she'd sat 37 years ago when she'd made the decision to disappear from the underground fighting circuit to become someone safe and predictable. Someone who wouldn't draw the wrong kind of attention. David opened a leather portfolio and withdrew several sheets of paper, printouts from websites with names like Active Aging and Senior Wellness. Mabel recognized the thoroughness, the same methodical approach he'd used for his senior thesis, his business proposals, his divorce proceedings. I've been doing some research about age-appropriate activities for seniors. There are excellent programs at the community center. Book clubs, gentle yoga, pottery classes, things that would be more suitable for someone in your position. My position. Mabel's voice remained level, but something flickered behind her eyes that made Sarah shift uncomfortably. It was the same look Sarah remembered from childhood, the one that appeared when neighborhood bullies targeted David, or when teachers suggested Sarah wasn't college material because of her learning disability. "Mom, we're worried about you," Sarah said, leaning forward. "Mrs. Henderson called me last week. She saw you sparring with that young man. What's his name? Carlos? She said it looked dangerous." Carlos Mendez, 26, Army veteran, respectful and skilled. He'd been one of the first to treat her as a legitimate training partner rather than an amusing anomaly. Their sparring sessions had helped her remember combinations she'd thought lost to time, muscle memory surfacing like words in a half-forgotten language. Mabel found the worn spot on her chair's armrest, a groove worn smooth by decades of reading evenings. It had been her mother's clock, passed down through 3 generations of women who'd learned to keep their true selves carefully hidden. When she spoke, her voice carried a new quality, something that made both her children unconsciously straighten. "Tell me about your research, David." He consulted his papers with renewed confidence, missing the dangerous undercurrent in her tone. "I found several programs specifically designed for seniors: chair exercises, water aerobics, even some gentle martial arts forms adapted for people with limited mobility and, well, realistic expectations about physical capability." Realistic expectations. Mabel repeated the phrase like she was testing its flavor, finding it wanting. Tai Chi, for instance, David continued, warming to his subject. Very gentle, meditative, perfect for maintaining flexibility without the risk of injury. There's a group that meets Thursdays at the senior center. I spoke with the instructor, lovely woman, Mrs. Chen. She said she'd be delighted to have you join. Mrs. Chen, who moved through her forms with the grace of someone who'd never faced an opponent intent on violence, who'd never had to use her skills for anything more dangerous than stress relief. Mabel wondered what Mrs. Chen would think if she knew she was speaking to someone who had once fought 3 opponents in a single night, who'd earned her black belt not through demonstrations, but through combat. "Mom, I watched you last Tuesday. You were trying to keep up with people who could be your grandchildren. It looked difficult." Difficult. Sarah had seen her holding back, restraining herself to avoid revealing too much. What her daughter had interpreted as struggle was actually careful control, the discipline of someone who knew exactly how much force was necessary and how much was dangerous. "Difficult," David agreed, shuffling through his printouts. "And potentially dangerous. What happens when you get hurt? When you pull something, or worse? At your age, recovery times are longer, complications more likely. Your bones aren't as strong as they used to be. Your reflexes aren't as sharp." If only he knew. If only either of them knew about the speed that still lived in her hands, the precision that decades of practice had burned into her nervous system. They saw a middle-aged librarian playing at being young. They had no idea they were looking at someone who had once been called Silent Storm, who'd moved through opponents like weather itself. Mabel stood and walked to the window, her movements fluid despite her supposed limitations. Outside, a sparrow defended its territory against a larger crow, diving and weaving with fearless precision. The smaller bird refused to yield, using speed and intelligence to overcome its disadvantage in size.
"You think I should take up pottery," she said without turning around. "It's a wonderful creative outlet," Sarah offered, her social worker instincts seeking common ground. "Mrs. Patterson makes beautiful vases. She says it's very therapeutic, very peaceful." Peaceful. The word tasted like ash in Mabel's mouth. Peace was what she'd chosen 37 years ago, when she'd walked away from everything that made her feel alive. Peace was the compromise she'd made with a world that couldn't accept what she really was. Or chair exercises.
The research shows that low-impact activities are much more appropriate for maintaining health in older adults, David said, his confidence growing as he found his rhythm. There's no need to prove anything to anyone, Mom. You've raised your children, built a career, contributed to your community. You've earned the right to slow down, to enjoy the golden years. Golden years. Another euphemism for invisibility, for accepting irrelevance as the natural order of things, for disappearing gracefully into a world of doctor's appointments and early bird dinners. Mabel turned back to face them, and for a moment, something in her expression made David's confident smile falter. It was a look that belonged to someone else entirely, someone who'd never learned to make herself small or quiet or safe. "Earned the right," she repeated, her voice carrying layers of meaning her children couldn't understand. "How generous!" The sarcasm was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah caught it immediately, her social worker instincts recognizing the signs of someone whose patience was approaching its limit. She'd seen this look before, usually right before a client walked out of her office and never returned. "Mom, we're not trying to control you," Sarah said carefully, her professional training warring with her role as daughter. "We're worried because we love you." "Are you?" Mabel asked, tilting her head slightly. "Or are you worried because you're embarrassed?" David's facade cracked slightly, revealing the frustration beneath his careful composure. "That's not fair." "Isn't it? You're concerned about what Mrs. Henderson thinks, about how it looks to have a mother who doesn't fit into your neat categories of what a 58-year-old woman should be." "This has nothing to do with appearances," David snapped, his carefully prepared presentation forgotten. "This is about reality. You're not 25 anymore, Mom. You're not even 45. You're pushing 60, and it's time to start making age-appropriate choices." "Age-appropriate," Mabel said, as if tasting something bitter. The phrase hung between them like a gauntlet thrown down. "Like your age-appropriate decision to leave your wife for your 28-year-old assistant." The words landed like a physical blow. David's face flushed red, and Sarah sucked in a sharp breath. The careful facade of concerned children collapsed in an instant, revealing the raw emotions beneath. "That's completely different," David said through gritted teeth, his hands clenching into fists. "Is it? Or is it just different when it's your midlife crisis instead of mine?" The silence stretched between them, taut and dangerous. Sarah tried desperately to regain control of the conversation, to fulfill her role as peacemaker that she had been playing since childhood. "Mom, please, we didn't come here to fight. We came because we care about you and we're worried that you're trying to be something you're not." Mabel looked at her daughter for a long moment, seeing the genuine concern beneath the misguided assumptions. Sarah had always been the perceptive one, the one who noticed when things didn't quite add up, but even she couldn't see beyond the limits of her own understanding. "Something I'm not," she repeated softly. The words carried weight her children couldn't comprehend. "You're our mother," Sarah continued, encouraged by her mother's quieter tone. "You're a librarian, a pillar of the community. You volunteer at the food bank, you organize the children's reading program, you take care of everyone else. Jenny Torres is a lovely instructor, but those classes are designed for young people, people who are building their lives, not people who should be enjoying the life they've already built." Building their lives. As if life was a construction project with a clear endpoint. As if reaching 58 meant the building was complete, and all that remained was maintenance and gentle decay. "People like me should be content," Mabel said, understanding dawning in her voice. "Quiet. Appropriate." "Yes," David said, leaning forward with renewed enthusiasm. "Exactly. Mom, you've accomplished so much. You raised 2 successful children as a single mother after Dad died. You built a career, owned your home, put us both through college. You should be proud of what you've achieved and ready to enjoy a quieter phase of life." Phase. Again with the phases. As if her existence could be divided into neat segments with clear beginnings and endings. As if the woman who had once been called Silent Storm was just another phase to be outgrown and forgotten.
I've been thinking you might benefit from talking to someone, David continued, sensing victory within reach. A therapist, someone who specializes in life transitions for older adults. Dr. Martinez has an excellent reputation, and she has specific experience helping people process whatever's driving this need to prove themselves. The suggestion hung in the air like a declaration of war. Mabel looked from David to Sarah, seeing the well-meaning concern that masked their fundamental inability to see her as anything beyond their limited understanding of what a 58-year-old librarian should be. A therapist, she said, her voice perfectly neutral. To help you process whatever's driving this need to prove themselves, David explained, his confidence returning as he sensed victory. To help you find peace with aging gracefully. To help you understand that there's no shame in slowing down, in accepting your limitations. Limitations. The word echoed in Mabel's mind like a challenge. If only they knew what her real limitations were. Not the constraints of age or society's expectations, but the self-imposed boundaries she'd maintained for 37 years to keep herself and others safe. Mabel nodded slowly, as if considering his words with the gravity they deserved. Then she walked to the mantelpiece and picked up a small framed photo. Herself, at 35, holding baby Sarah while David clung to her leg. In the photo, she looked like any other suburban mother. Soft, safe, predictable. The perfect disguise. "You think you know who I am," she said quietly, her back still turned to them. "Of course we do," Sarah said, her voice filled with affection and certainty. "You're our mother. You're the strongest person we know." Strong. If only they understood what that word really meant. What kind of strength she'd been hiding from them all these years. "I'm your mother," Mabel agreed, setting the photo down with deliberate care. "But that's not all I am. It's not all I've ever been." She turned to face them both, and something in her posture had changed. A subtle shift that made the room feel suddenly smaller, more charged with potential energy. "I think you should leave now." David blinked, his prepared arguments dissolving in confusion. "Mom, we haven't finished." "Yes, we have." Her voice carried a finality that brooked no argument, the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I need some time to think about what you've said." Sarah stood slowly, recognizing the dismissal for what it was, and understanding that pushing further would accomplish nothing. "Mom, we really do love you. Everything we've said comes from a place of caring." "I know," Mabel said, and her voice was gentle again, the dangerous edge carefully sheathed. "I love you too. That's why I'm asking you to leave." David gathered his papers with obvious frustration, his careful presentation reduced to crumpled printouts and highlighted statistics. "This conversation isn't over, Mom. We're not just going to stand by and watch you hurt yourself." "No," Mabel agreed, walking them to the door with the measured pace as someone who'd learned to control every movement. "It's not." She stood in the doorway and watched them drive away, David's agitation evident in the sharp way he reversed out of her driveway. Sarah lingered longer, rolling down her window to offer a small wave and a concerned smile before following her brother down the quiet suburban street. Mabel closed the door and leaned against it, listening to the house settle around her. The silence felt different now, charged with possibility rather than simply empty. Upstairs in the back of her bedroom closet, a dusty box waited patiently behind her winter coats. Inside that box lay evidence of a life her children couldn't imagine, proof of a woman they'd never met. Silent Storm had been quiet for 37 years, buried beneath layers of respectability and careful normalcy. But David was right about one thing. This conversation wasn't over. It was just beginning. Mabel stood at the bottom of the stairs, listening to the muffled voices from her living room. They hadn't left. Of course they hadn't. David's voice carried clearly through the walls, his tone sharp with the authority of someone accustomed to get in his way through persistence and superior planning. "She's clearly having some kind of breakdown," he was saying.
Did you see how she reacted when I mentioned therapy? That's not normal behavior, Sarah. Maybe because you basically called her crazy, Sarah's voice replied, though it lacked conviction. David, you can't just steamroll people into accepting help. I'm not steamrolling anyone. I'm trying to save our mother from making a fool of herself. Do you want to watch her get hurt? Do you want to explain to the emergency room why our 58-year-old mother thought she could fight people half her age? Mabel's hand found the banister, her grip tightening until her knuckles showed white beneath her skin. Half her age. The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they revealed how little her own children understood about age, about capability, about the difference between looking vulnerable and being vulnerable. She climbed the stairs with deliberate quiet, her feet finding the spots that didn't creak from decades of navigating this house in darkness. Their voices faded as she reached the second floor, but she could still feel the weight of their concern, their certainty that they knew what was best for her life. Her bedroom was exactly as she'd left it that morning, bed made with military precision, books stacked neatly on the nightstand, reading glasses folded beside a half-finished crossword puzzle. The room of a woman who lived a careful, predictable life. The room of someone who'd spent 37 years perfecting the art of being unremarkable. The closet door opened with a soft whisper of hinges that needed oil. Behind her winter coats, pushed far back against the wall where curious grandchildren or helpful friends would never think to look, sat a cardboard box marked Christmas decorations in her careful handwriting. The lie had served her well for decades. Mabel pulled the box down with both hands, surprised by its weight after all these years. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light as she set it on her bed and carefully lifted the lid. The smell hit her first. Leather and old paper, the faint scent of the gymnasium where she trained 6 days a week, the ghost of sweat and determination, and a kind of joy she hadn't felt in decades. The black belt lay on top, coiled like a sleeping serpent. The silk was still lustrous despite the years. The gold embroidery of her name, her real name, the one that had once struck fear into opponents across 3 states, still gleaming against the dark fabric. She lifted it with reverent hands, feeling the weight of memory settle around her shoulders like an old coat. Beneath the belt lay newspaper clippings, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. Headlines in bold print: Silent Storm dominates tournament. Mystery fighter takes championship. Who is Silent Storm? The photo showed a woman in her early 20s, lean and dangerous, her eyes holding a confidence that bordered on arrogance. A woman who'd never learned to make herself small or quiet or safe. There were programs from tournaments, fight cards with her stage name listed among legends of the underground circuit, official rankings that placed her in the top 5 female fighters in the country, letters from promoters offering increasingly large purses for exhibitions, and at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper like something precious, the trophy from her final tournament, a crystal pyramid engraved with her fighting name and the date, November 15th, 1987. The date she'd watched Vincent Torino murder a young fighter named Tommy Chen for refusing to throw a match. The date she'd realized that the world she'd loved was built on blood and corruption. The date Silent Storm had died and Mabel Anderson had been born. She selected the most impressive newspaper clipping, a full-page feature from the sports section with action photos and an interview that portrayed her as an unstoppable force, and folded it carefully into her pocket. The belt came next, coiled loosely in her hands like a statement waiting to be made. Downstairs, the voices had grown more animated. As she descended the stairs, fragments of conversation reached her ears. Completely out of character for her to be so defensive. Maybe we should call Dr. Peterson, see what he thinks. Intervention might be the wrong approach, but something has to be done. Mabel paused at the living room entrance, taking in the scene with the tactical awareness that had never truly left her. David had claimed her reading chair, her papers spread across her coffee table like evidence in a trial. Sarah sat on the edge of the couch, her body language torn between loyalty and doubt. They'd rearranged her space to suit their purposes, another small assertion of control disguised as concern. "I can hear you," she said quietly. Both heads turned toward her, guilt flickering across their faces before being quickly replaced by renewed determination. David straightened in her chair, with the confidence of someone who believed righteousness was on his side. "Mom, we've been talking and we think—" "I know what you think." Mabel moved into the room with fluid steps, the black belt hidden behind her back. "You think I'm having a breakdown. You think I need professional help. You think I'm embarrassing myself, and by extension, embarrassing you." "That's not—" Sarah began, but Mabel held up her free hand. "Let me finish." The words carried an authority that made both her children fall silent. You think you know who I am. You think you understand my capabilities, my limitations, my place in the world. You think I should be content with book clubs and gentle yoga and accepting that my life is essentially over, except for the slow decline toward irrelevance. David's jaw tightened. Mom, that's not what we're saying. We're saying you should be realistic about what I am. I finished her thought as she placed the black belt on the coffee table right on top of David's carefully prepared research papers. The silence that followed was so complete that the grandfather clock's ticking seemed to echo like gunshots. David stared at the belt as if it were a snake that might strike him. Sarah's mouth opened slightly, her social worker training warring with the evidence before her eyes. "What is that?" David asked, though his voice suggested he already knew and didn't want to believe it. "This," Mabel said, settling into the chair opposite him, the guest chair in her own living room, "is my third-degree black belt in mixed martial arts. I earned it on June 14th, 1987, in a tournament in Atlantic City where I defeated 3 opponents in a single night." She reached into her pocket and unfolded the newspaper clipping, smoothing it out beside the belt. The headline blazed across the yellowed paper: "Silent Storm Continues Undefeated Streak." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes scanning the article with growing amazement. The photo showed a woman in fighting stance, her body coiled with lethal precision, her face bearing only a passing resemblance to the gentle librarian they'd known all their lives. This is you?" Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "This was me," Mabel confirmed. "Before I became your mother, before I became a librarian, before I learned to hide what I was capable of." David snatched up the clipping, his eyes moving rapidly across the text. His face cycled through disbelief, shock, and something that might have been fear. "This says you were ranked 3rd in the country? This says you were undefeated in 17 professional matches?" 18, Mabel corrected quietly. "I had one more fight after that article was written." "Professional fights?" Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "Mom, you were a professional fighter?" "I was many things you never knew about." Mabel's tone was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather rather than overturning everything her children thought they knew about their mother. "I was Silent Storm. I was ranked in the top 5 female fighters in the underground circuit. I made more money in a single night than most people made in a month." David set the clipping down with shaking hands. "This is impossible. You never said anything, not once. How could you hide something like this?" "The same way you hid your affair for 8 months, Mabel replied, her voice carrying no judgment, only observation. "People hide what they need to hide." The comparison hit its mark. David flinched as if he'd struck him physically, his face flushing with anger and embarrassment. "That's completely different," he said through gritted teeth. That was a mistake. This is lying about who you are for our entire lives." "Is it lying? Or is it simply not telling you everything? Did you tell me about every girlfriend you had in college? Did you share every detail of your business dealings? Did Sarah tell me about her first marriage before she told me about the divorce?" Sarah jerked upright. "How did you—" "Because I pay attention," Mabel said simply. "Because I notice things. Because being observant and tactical and aware of everything around me isn't something I learned at library school." She stood and walked to the mantelpiece, running her fingers along the edge of a family photo. "You've spent the last hour telling me what I should be, what I should do, how I should act. You've diagnosed me, prescribed treatment, and planned my future without once asking what I wanted. You've treated me like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be understood." "Because we didn't know." David exploded, rising from his chair with enough force to scatter his papers. "How could we understand if you never told us? How could we know our mother was some kind of professional fighter?" "Would it have changed anything?" Mabel turned to face him, her posture shifting subtly into something more centered, more grounded. "If you'd known that I was once called Silent Storm, would you have treated me differently today? Would you have listened when I said I was capable of making my own decisions?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. David opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, his certainty wavering for the first time since he'd arrived. Sarah picked up the newspaper clipping again, studying the photo more closely. "Mom, this woman in the picture, she looks so dangerous." Mabel suggested. Confident? Alive? Young, Sarah finished quietly. She looks so young and fierce and free. I was, Mabel said, returning to her chair. I was all of those things, and then I walked away from it. Why? The question came from David, his anger momentarily overwhelmed by confusion. If you were that successful, if you were ranked that highly, why would you give it up? Mabel was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant with memory. Because I saw something I shouldn't have seen. Because staying would have meant compromising everything I believed in. Because sometimes the thing you love most becomes the thing that can destroy you. She looked at both her children, seeing them struggle to reconcile this new information with their lifelong assumptions. I chose to become someone safe, someone predictable, someone who could raise children and work a steady job and live a quiet life without drawing the wrong kind of attention. So you became a librarian, Sarah said, understanding beginning to dawn in her voice. I became your mother, Mabel corrected. Everything else was just the cover story. David sank back into his chair, the weight of revelation pressing down on him. 37 years. You've been hiding this for 37 years? Not hiding, Mabel said firmly. Protecting. Protecting you, protecting myself, protecting the life we built together. You think I don't understand the consequences of aging? You think I don't know my body isn't what it used to be? I've spent decades evaluating my capabilities, adjusting my expectations, and finding new ways to challenge myself without crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed. She gestured toward the belt lying innocuously on the coffee table. That martial arts class you're so concerned about, it's the first time in 37 years that I've allowed myself to remember who I used to be. It's the first time I've let Silent Storm stretch her legs just a little bit. Silent Storm, Sarah repeated the name softly, testing how it sounded. That was really you? That was really me. And she's still here, underneath all the cardigans and sensible shoes and 37 years of being appropriate. She's still here, and she's tired of being quiet. The admission settled over the room like a storm front moving in. David stared at the belt as if it might suddenly spring to life and attack him. Sarah looked between the newspaper clipping and her mother's face, searching for traces of the fierce young woman in the familiar features. "What does this mean?" David asked finally, his voice smaller than it had been all afternoon. "It means," Mabel said, reaching for the black belt and running her fingers along its length, "that your intervention has failed. It means that I'm not having a breakdown or a crisis or a phase that needs to be managed. It means that for the first time in decades, I'm remembering who I used to be, and I like what I remember." Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She stood, the belt in her hands, like a declaration of independence. It means that your 58-year-old mother is not the fragile, confused woman you think she is, and it means that this conversation really is just beginning. The grandfather clock chimed the hour, its resonant notes filling the silence that followed. Outside, the afternoon was fading toward evening, painting the room in shades of gold and amber. Inside, everything had changed, and there was no going back to the comfortable assumptions that had governed their family for nearly 34 decades. Silent Storm was no longer sleeping, and Mabel Anderson was finally ready to let her breathe. 3 days had passed since the revelation, and Mabel Anderson sat behind the circulation desk at Millbrook Public Library, watching dust motes dance in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through tall windows. The normalcy of her surroundings felt surreal after the upheaval in her living room. The same patrons shuffled between the stacks, the same children whispered over picture books, the same elderly volunteers sorted returned materials with methodical precision, but everything had changed. David hadn't spoken to her since Tuesday evening when he'd left her house clutching his crumpled research papers like talismans that had failed to ward off an unwelcome truth. Sarah had called twice, her voice carefully neutral as she asked how Mabel was processing everything. Neither conversation had lasted more than 5 minutes. The library phone rang with its familiar electronic trill, cutting through the peaceful quiet of the reference section. Mabel glanced at the caller ID, number blocked, before lifting the receiver. Millbrook Public Library, reference desk? Silent storm. The voice was gravelly, unfamiliar, carrying the weight of years and cigarettes. Been a long time. Mabel's hand tightened on the receiver. Around her, the library continued its quiet business, but the air seemed to thicken with danger she hadn't felt in 37 years. "I don't think you have the wrong number," she said carefully, her voice steady despite the ice forming in her veins. "Margaret Chen Anderson, born 1967, fighting weight 135 pounds, undefeated in 18 professional matches before you disappeared like smoke in the wind." The voice paused, letting each detail land like a physical blow. "Still think I have the wrong number?" She'd never used her birth name in the fighting circuit. The fact that this caller knew it meant resources, planning, patience, professional attention she'd hoped never to attract again. "What do you want?" The question came out sharper than intended, drawing a curious glance from Mrs. Patterson, who was restocking the new releases display nearby. "Nothing much, just a conversation. Face to face. Old time's sake." "I don't have conversations about old times." "You will." The voice carried absolute certainty. "See, I've got something that belongs to you. Someone, actually. Your old teacher, Lu Wei. Sweet old man, runs a little tea shop downtown. Makes excellent jasmine tea, by the way." The world seemed to tilt slightly. Mabel gripped the edge of her desk, forcing herself to breathe normally. Master Lu Wei, who'd been more father than teacher, who'd shaped not just her fighting technique, but her understanding of honor, courage, and the responsibility that came with strength. "I don't know what you're talking about," but her voice betrayed her with the slightest tremor. "Course you don't. Lu Wei doesn't exist. Silent storm never happened. You're just a nice librarian who helps kids with their homework and organizes book sales." The laugh that followed was ugly, knowing. "Except we both know that's bullshit, don't we?" Earlier that morning, 3 blocks away, Master Lu Wei moved through his morning routine with the precision of ritual. At 73, his body had surrendered much to time, but his movements still carried echoes of the grace that once made him legendary in fighting circles from Taiwan to California. The Golden Dragon Tea Shop was his sanctuary, a small storefront filled with the aromatic comfort of leaves from across Asia and the gentle wisdom of decades spent in pursuit of balance. He was arranging a display of white tea when the bell above his door chimed. 3 men entered, their bulk incongruous among the delicate teacups and silk scrolls that decorated his shop. The largest one, built like a professional wrestler with scars marking his knuckles, let his eyes roam the space with predatory assessment. "You Lu Wei?" the big man asked, his voice carrying the particular flatness of someone accustomed to intimidation. "I am." Lu Wei straightened to his full height, which barely reached the man's shoulders. "How may I help you?" "Name's Tank Williams. We need to talk." Lu Wei recognized the type immediately, muscled for hire. Dangerous, but lacking the intelligence to be truly unpredictable. The 2 men flanking him carried themselves with similar brutish confidence, but their eyes held the twitchy alertness of users rather than professionals. "My shop is open to all who come in teas," Lu Wei said formally. "What kind of tea interests you?" Tank's laugh was harsh and humorless. "The kind that tells me where to find Silent Storm." The name hit like a physical blow, though Lu Wei's expression didn't change. He'd spent 37 years expecting this conversation, preparing for the day when his past and hers would collide with present reality. "I'm afraid I don't understand," he said quietly. "Sure you don't." Tank stepped closer, his massive frame casting a shadow across the tea display. "Vincent Torino sends his regards, by the way. Says to tell you he's got a long memory and lots of patience." Vincent Torino. Lu Wei remembered the young man who'd inherited his father's criminal empire and brought it into the underground fighting world with ruthless efficiency. The same man who'd corrupted what should have been pure competition with threats, fixed matches, and ultimately murder. "Mr. Torino and I have no business together," Lu Wei said. "That's where you're wrong, old man." Tank's hand shot out with surprising speed, gripping Lu Wei's wrist in a crushing hold. "You trained her, you know where she is, and you're gonna help us have a little reunion." Lu Wei tested the grip with solid pressure, feeling the strength behind it. These men could overpower him easily, but they'd underestimated what 30 decades of preparation could accomplish. He'd always known this day might come. "I trained many students over the years," he said calmly. "Perhaps if you were more specific?" Tank's grip tightened until bone ground against bone. "Don't fuck with me. Silent Storm, your little prodigy who cost Mr. Torino a lot of money and reputation when she vanished into thin air. Ring any bells?" "I remember a young woman named Mabel," Lu Wei said carefully. "But she married, had children, lives a quiet life now. Not the person you're looking for." "See, that's where you're wrong, again." Tank released his wrist and stepped back, gesturing to his companions. "Tony, start breaking things, quietly." One of the men began systematically destroying Lu Wei's carefully arranged display, porcelain shattering with soft crashes that wouldn't carry to the street. 30 years of building this peaceful space, reduced to fragments in seconds. "Stop!" Lu Wei's voice carried command authority that made all three men pause. "What do you want?" "Simple. You're gonna make a phone call. Tell Silent Storm that old friends want to catch up. Set up a meeting." "And if I refuse?" Tank smiled with genuine pleasure. "Then we keep breaking things. Your shop, your bones, whatever it takes. But either way, you're coming with us. Insurance, you might say." Lu Wei looked around his shop, seeing not just the destruction but the violation of the sanctuary he'd spent decades creating. These men understood nothing of honor or respect, only the crude application of force. They were exactly the kind of corruption that had driven him to leave the fighting world behind. "I'll need to close the shop properly," he said finally. "Tony'll help you with that." Tank nodded toward the man who'd been destroying the tea display. "Real helpful guy, Tony. Knows all about closing shops." As Lu Wei moved toward his cash register, his fingers brushed against the small panic button hidden beneath the counter. But he didn't press it. The police would ask questions he couldn't answer, would involve authorities in matters that belonged to a world they couldn't understand. This was between the people who remembered when Silent Storm had been more than a librarian's secret. "Don't try anything cute," Tank warned, but Lu Wei was already moving with careful cooperation, his hands visible and steady. He locked the register, turned off the lights, and flipped the sign in his window from open to closed. As they escorted him toward a black SUV parked outside, he caught sight of his reflection in the shop's window, an old man being led away by thugs. But his expression was calm, almost serene. He'd been Mabel's teacher once. Now it was time to see how well his lessons had taken root. Back at the library. "You've got 2 hours to think about it," the voice on the phone continued. 2 hours to remember that some debts don't disappear just because you change your name and learn the Dewey Decimal System." "I don't know who you think I am," Mabel said, but the words felt hollow even to her. "Vincent Torino knows exactly who you are. He's known for years, just been waiting for the right moment. See, finding you was never the problem. The problem was making sure you'd care enough to show up." "Show up where?" "I'll call back with details. 2 hours, Silent Storm. Don't disappoint us." The line went dead. Mabel sat holding the silent receiver, her mind racing through possibilities and plans with the tactical awareness she'd spent decades suppressing. Around her, the library continued its peaceful routine, but she was no longer part of that world. She was back in a place where strength mattered more than kindness, where hesitation could mean death. She dialed Lu Wei's shop from memory, a number she'd memorized but never called. The phone rang 6 times before rolling to voicemail. His familiar voice, speaking in both English and Mandarin, invited callers to leave a message. She hung up without speaking. There was no such thing as coincidence in the world she'd left behind. If Vincent Torino had found her, if he'd connected her to Lu Wei, then the old man was already gone. The only question was whether he was still alive. Mabel looked around the library, at Mrs. Patterson, arranging books with loving care, at the teenagers clustered around computers, at the young mother reading softly to her toddler in the children's section. This was the world she'd chosen, the life she'd built through 37 years of careful invisibility. But Master Lu Wei had given her more than fighting skills. He'd taught her about duty, about the obligations that came with strength, about the bonds between teacher and student that transcended time and circumstance. She picked up the phone and dialed Lu Wei's shop from memory. The phone rang 6 times before rolling to voicemail. His familiar voice, speaking in both English and Mandarin, invited callers to leave a message. She hung up without speaking. There was no such thing as coincidence in the world she'd left behind. If Vincent Torino had found her, if he'd connected her to Lu Wei, then the old man was already gone. The only question was whether he was still alive. Mabel looked around the library, at Mrs. Patterson arranging books with loving care, at the teenagers clustered around computers, at the young mother reading softly to her toddler in the children's section. This was the world she'd chosen, the life she'd built through 37 years of careful invisibility. But Master Lu Wei had given her more than fighting skills. He'd taught her about duty, about the obligations that came with strength, about the bonds between teacher and student that transcended time and circumstance. She picked up the phone and dialed the library's main office. "This is Mabel at the reference desk. I need to take the rest of the day off. Family emergency." The lie came easily, though it wasn't really a lie. Lu Wei was more family than her own children had proven to be. He'd seen her potential when she was just a frightened teenager, had shaped her into something formidable and beautiful and dangerous. Now someone had taken him because of what she used to be. Silent Storm had been sleeping for 37 years, but some people, she was beginning to remember, should never be awakened. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave the library, Mabel felt the familiar weight of tactical assessment settling over her like an old coat. Exits, sight lines, potential weapons, escape routes. The training Lu Wei had drilled into her until it became instinct. Somewhere in the city, Vincent Torino was waiting for her to remember who she used to be. He had no idea what he'd just set in motion. The librarian was going home.
The 28-year-old former soldier was exactly the kind of person Mabel needed, someone who understood that the world contained real dangers, someone whose training had prepared her for situations that fell outside normal civilian experience. But trust was a luxury Mabel couldn't afford to grant easily, not when Lu Wei's life hung in the balance. She entered the building through the side door, bypassing the main reception area where volunteers might ask well-meaning questions about her early arrival. The hallway smelled of industrial disinfectant and the rubber mats used for various fitness classes. Her footsteps echoed softly on polished linoleum as she made her way toward the gymnasium. Lena looked up as Mabel approached, noting immediately that something was different. The older woman's usual calm demeanor had been replaced by something more alert, more focused. Military training had taught Lena to recognize when someone was operating under stress, and every line of Mabel's body language screamed controlled tension. "You're early," Lena observed, shifting her gym bag to make room on the bleacher beside her. "Needed to think," Mabel replied, settling onto the metal bench with careful precision. "Mind if I ask you something?" "Shoot." Mabel studied Lena's profile as the younger woman watched Jenny's class practice basic defensive stances. "When you were deployed, did you ever have to make decisions based on incomplete information? Situations where waiting for perfect intelligence meant people got hurt?" The question was oddly specific, and Lena turned to face her fully. Up close, she could see tension lines around Mabel's eyes that hadn't been there the previous week. "Every day," Lena said carefully. "Why?" "What if someone you cared about was in danger? Someone who'd been there for you when no one else would? How far would you go to help them?" The hypothetical nature of the question didn't fool Lena for a second. In her experience, people didn't ask abstract questions about rescue scenarios unless they were facing concrete decisions about actual rescues. "Depends on the situation," Lena replied, matching Mabel's careful tone. "Who's in trouble?" Mabel was quiet for a long moment, watching Jenny demonstrate a proper defensive stance to a gangly 15-year-old who moved like his limbs belonged to someone else. The normalcy of the scene felt surreal given the darkness that had just entered her life. "Someone from my past," she said finally. "Someone who taught me everything important I know about discipline and honor, and understanding the difference between strength and violence. And this person is in danger how? Kidnapped this morning by people who want something from me." The words hung between them like a bridge neither could uncross. Lena's military experience had included enough intelligence briefings to understand the implications of targeted kidnapping. Someone had identified a pressure point and applied leverage with surgical precision. "What kind of people?" Lena asked. "The kind who remember things from 37 years ago. The kind who hold grudges across decades and have the resources to act on them." Lena shifted slightly, her body language unconsciously moving into a more defensive position. "And they took this person to get to you specifically. Because they know who I used to be." Mabel turned to meet Lena's eyes directly. "Before I became a librarian, before I learned to be quiet and appropriate and safe." "Who were you?" The question was asked quietly, but Lena's tone suggested she was prepared for an answer that might change everything about how she understood the woman sitting beside her. "I was someone who fought professionally, someone who won 18 consecutive matches in underground tournaments across 3 states, someone who disappeared one night in 1987 and never looked back." Lena studied Mabel's face with the analytical precision of someone trained to assess threats and assets. The gentle librarian who'd been attending martial arts classes for stress relief was revealing layers of complexity that recontextualized everything Lena thought she knew about professional fighting. Lena repeated. "What kind of professional fighting requires people to disappear? The kind that operates outside legal oversight, the kind where matches get fixed, and people who refuse to cooperate sometimes don't make it home." Understanding dawned in Lena's expression. She'd heard stories during her military service about underground fighting circuits that served as recruitment pools for private military contractors and criminal organizations, places where violence was currency and reputation could be literally a matter of life and death. "You witnessed something," Lena said. It wasn't a question. "I saw a young man murdered because he wouldn't throw a match. The person who ordered his death has spent 37 years looking for the witness who cost him money and face."
Across the gymnasium, Jenny dismissed her youth class with encouragement and gentle corrections about their form. The teenagers gathered their belongings with the easy laughter of people whose biggest concerns involved homework and social drama. Their innocence felt precious and fragile in the context of the conversation taking place on the bleachers. "So what's the play?" Lena asked, her tone shifting into something more professional. "I don't know yet. They're supposed to call back with details." "How do you know this isn't a trap? How do you know your teacher is even still alive?" The questions were harsh but necessary, the kind of tactical assessment that could mean the difference between rescue and walking into an ambush. Mabel appreciated the directness as it forced her to confront possibilities she didn't want to consider. "I don't," she admitted, "but Lu Wei taught me that some obligations transcend personal safety, that honor isn't about making smart choices, it's about making right choices." Lena nodded slowly. Military service had taught her similar lessons about duty and sacrifice, about the bonds that connected people who'd shared danger and trusted each other with their lives. "What do you need from me?" The offer came without hesitation, and Mabel felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was clenched tight. She'd spent 37 years trusting no one outside her carefully constructed, normal life. The idea that someone might be willing to step into danger based on nothing more than respect and shared training was terrifying and deeply moving. "I need someone who understands tactics, someone who won't panic if things go wrong, someone who can watch my back while I try to figure out how to save a 73-year-old man from people who have every advantage except one." "What's the one advantage?" "They think they're dealing with Silent Storm from 1987. They have no idea what 37 years of discipline and patience and careful observation have turned her into." Jenny Torres approached the bleachers, her expression curious as she took in the intense conversation taking place between two of her students. Something in their body language suggested this wasn't casual pre-class discussion. "Everything okay over here?" Jenny asked, settling her equipment bag on the floor beside the bleachers. Mabel and Lena exchanged a glance, and Mabel made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. Jenny Torres had been teaching martial arts for 15 years. She'd seen students come and go, had watched people discover strength they didn't know they possessed. More importantly, she had created an environment where people could be honest about their capabilities without judgment. "Jenny," she said carefully, "what do you know about professional fighting circuits?" The question clearly wasn't what Jenny had expected. She settled onto the bleacher beside them, her instructor instincts recognizing the shift from casual conversation to something more serious. "Legitimate professional fighting, or the kind that doesn't appear on official records?" "The second kind." Jenny was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving between Mabel and Lena with growing understanding. "I know enough to recognize when someone's background involves more than recreational training. I know enough to respect that some stories don't get told without good reason. And if someone needed help with a situation that fell outside normal channels, I'd ask what they needed and how I could provide it. Martial arts isn't just about forms and techniques. It's about community. It's about having each other's backs when the world gets dangerous." Mabel felt the last of her resistance crumble. These women, one who had served her country in war zones, another who had dedicated her life to teaching others how to protect themselves, represented something she'd thought lost forever. They were allies, people who understood that sometimes the right choice was also the dangerous choice. "My former teacher has been kidnapped by people who want to settle a score from 1987. They're going to call tonight with instructions for a meeting that's almost certainly a trap." Jenny's expression shifted into something more focused, more tactical. "What kind of resources are we talking about? How organized are these people?" "Organized enough to find me after 37 years. Organized enough to identify Lu Wei as leverage. Organized enough to make this personal rather than simply killing me from a distance." Lena leaned forward, her military training engaging with the tactical problem. "That suggests they want something more than just revenge."
More importantly, he'd managed to communicate something crucial in those few words. These men understand nothing of honor. They measure everything in money and fear. Lu Wei was telling her that their captors were amateurs in the ways that mattered. Professional criminals, perhaps, but not warriors. They thought intimidation and violence were the same thing. They had no understanding of the discipline that turned violence into something precise and purposeful. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Mom, David says you're acting strange. Are you okay? Can we talk?" Instead of responding to Sarah, Mabel called Lena. "We need to accelerate the timeline," she said when Lena answered, "and we need to gather intelligence tonight." "What's the plan?" "You still have contacts from your service days, people who might know about criminal operations in the Port District?" "Maybe. Why?" "Because I want to know exactly who we're dealing with before we walk into their trap." That evening, Mabel sat in her car across the street from the Anchor Tavern, a dive bar 3 blocks from Pier 47 that Lena's contacts had identified as a known hangout for Vincent Torino's organization. The building was exactly what she'd expected: grimy windows, neon beer signs, and the kind of clientele that conducted business in cash and never asked unnecessary questions. Lena sat in the passenger seat, a pair of binoculars in her lap and a notebook for recording observations. They'd been watching for 2 hours, cataloging faces and license plates, building a picture of the organization they'd be facing tomorrow night. "Black SUV just pulled up," Lena murmured, raising the binoculars. 3 men getting out. Big guy in front matches the description Jenny got from her police contact, Marcus Williams, a.k.a. Tank. Mabel studied the massive figure emerging from the vehicle. Even from a distance, Tank Williams projected the kind of physical presence that made normal people step out of his way. But Mabel had fought men like him before, all muscle and intimidation, assuming that size was the same thing as skill. "He moves like a brawler," she observed. "Strong, but not technically trained. Probably relies on overwhelming opponents with size and aggression." The other 2? Mabel watched as Tank's companions followed him into the bar. Both were smaller, but carried themselves with the twitchy alertness of men who'd learned to survive through violence and paranoia. Enforcers. Street-level muscle. Dangerous in groups, but individually probably not much of a threat. A silver Mercedes pulled up as they watched, and Mabel felt her blood cool as she recognized the man who emerged from the driver's seat. Older now, graying at the temples, but unmistakably Vincent Torino. He moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "That's him," she said quietly. "Vincent Torino, the man who's been hunting me for 37 years. Lena lowered the binoculars and looked at Mabel with concern. "You okay?" "I'm remembering why I disappeared." Mabel's voice was steady, but her hands had clenched into fists without her realizing it. "He killed a young man named Tommy Chen because Tommy wouldn't throw a match. Beat him to death with his bare hands while a room full of people watched and did nothing. And you were there?" "I was supposed to fight Tommy in the semifinals. Instead, I watched Vincent murder him and realized that everything I loved about fighting had been corrupted into something monstrous." They sat in silence for a moment, watching Vincent disappear into the bar. The weight of decades-old trauma mixed with the immediate danger of their current situation, creating a toxic combination of memory and anticipation. "We should go," Lena said finally. "We've seen enough." As they drove away, Mabel's phone rang. David's number appeared on the display, and she answered with resigned exhaustion. "Mom, where are you? I've been sitting in your driveway for an hour." "I'm running errands." "At 9 o'clock at night? Mom, this has to stop. Sarah found some old photos in your basement when she was looking for Christmas decorations. Photos of you that don't match anything you've ever told us about yourself." Mabel closed her eyes briefly. The box of memorabilia wasn't the only evidence of her past hidden in the house. If Sarah had been thorough in her search, she'd found much more than tournament photos. "We'll talk tomorrow." "No, we'll talk tonight. I'm not leaving until we resolve this situation. You're clearly having some kind of episode, and as your family, we have a responsibility to—" Mabel ended the call without waiting for him to finish. "Family trouble?"
My children think I'm having a breakdown because I won't accept their definition of what a 58-year-old woman should be. Are you? The question was asked without judgment, but it carried weight. Lena had seen combat, had watched people make decisions under extreme stress. She understood the difference between rational planning and emotional reaction. I'm remembering who I used to be and accepting that some parts of that person were worth preserving. Even if it means risking everything you've built since then? Mabel thought about her quiet house, her job at the library, the peaceful routine she had maintained for 37 years. Then she thought about Lu Wei's voice on the phone, tired but unbroken, still trying to protect her even from captivity. Some things are worth the risk, she said finally. When they reached Maple Street, David's BMW was still parked in her driveway, and lights were on in her living room. Through the front window, she could see two figures waiting inside, David and Sarah having used the spare key to let themselves in. Want backup? Not for this conversation. Mabel gathered her things and prepared to face another kind of confrontation entirely. But tomorrow night, I'll need all the help I can get. As she walked toward her house, Mabel realized that the most dangerous part of the next 24 hours might not be facing Vincent Torino and his thugs. It might be convincing her own children that Silent Storm wasn't a breakdown. She was a homecoming. The confrontation with David and Sarah had lasted until nearly midnight, ending only when Mabel had threatened to call the police if they didn't leave her house immediately. David had stormed out with promises of legal intervention and psychiatric evaluations, while Sarah had lingered in the doorway, her expression torn between loyalty and genuine concern for her mental state. Now, 18 hours later, Mabel sat in Lena's Honda Civic 3 blocks from the Red Dog Casino, watching evening foot traffic flow in and out of the converted warehouse that served as Vincent Torino's primary money laundering operation. The building's exterior had been designed to look legitimate: fresh paint, professional signage, and uniformed security guards who carried themselves with the bearing of off-duty police officers supplementing their income. "Are you sure about this?" Lena asked for the third time, adjusting the small wireless earpiece that connected them to Jenny, who was monitoring police frequencies from the community center. "We could wait, gather more intelligence, plan this better." "Lu Wei doesn't have time for better planning," Mabel replied, checking her appearance in the passenger side mirror. She'd spent an hour that afternoon transforming herself into someone 20 years older and significantly more frail. Gray wig, heavy makeup to create age spots and deeper wrinkles, and a slight tremor in her hands that suggested early-stage Parkinson's. Lena looked equally transformed, though in the opposite direction. Her military short hair had been hidden beneath a fashionable blonde wig, and careful makeup had softened her features into something more traditionally feminine. She wore a short dress that showed enough leg to distract from the concealed knife strapped to her thigh, and her posture had shifted from military bearing to casual confidence of a young woman looking for excitement. "Remember," Mabel said, settling into the character she'd been developing all day, "you're Amy, my granddaughter, recently divorced, looking for some fun. I'm Grandma Rose. Your late grandfather's gambling addiction is finally paying off because you inherited his system for picking winners. And if Tank Williams shows up, then we adapt." Mabel's voice carried the calm authority of someone who'd learned to think tactically under pressure. "But according to your contacts, he usually doesn't arrive until after 10. We should have plenty of time to gather what we need and get out." They walked toward the casino entrance with Mabel leaning heavily on Lena's arm, her shuffle convincing enough to earn sympathetic glances from other patrons. The security guards barely looked at them. An elderly woman and her granddaughter hardly registered as potential threats to men accustomed to watching for professional gamblers and undercover police officers. "There," Lena murmured, guiding Mabel toward a section of the casino that had been partitioned off with velvet ropes. Beyond the ropes, Mabel could see a different kind of gambling taking place. Large screens showed fight footage, while men placed bets with the intensity of people wagering on inside information.
This was the recruitment center Jenny's police contact had mentioned. where Vincent Torino's organization identified potential fighters and deep-pocketed spectators for underground tournaments. "Excuse me," Mabel approached the rope with the hesitant enthusiasm of someone trying something new. "My granddaughter heard you might have some, more exciting betting opportunities." The guard manning the rope was young and obviously new, his uncertainty evident as he looked between the elderly woman and the attractive blonde beside her. These weren't the typical demographics for underground fight betting. "It's members only," he said uncertainly. "Oh." Mabel's disappointment was perfectly calibrated. "Amy said her ex-husband used to come to places like this. She thought maybe we could win back some of the money he lost during their divorce." Lena stepped forward with exactly the right combination of flirtation and vulnerability. "I know it sounds crazy, but my grandfather always said he had a system for picking fighters, something about their stance and footwork. I thought maybe—" She let the sentence trail off with a shrug that drew the guard's attention to her décolletage. "Well," the guard said, clearly struggling with protocol versus the desire to be helpful to an attractive woman, "I suppose I could let you look around for a few minutes, but you can't place any bets without a member sponsor." They were inside the roped-off area within seconds, and Mabel felt the familiar thrill of a successful infiltration. Her eyes moved constantly, cataloging faces and conversations while maintaining the persona of a confused grandmother trying to understand the appeal of organized violence. The betting area was more sophisticated than she had anticipated. Multiple screens showed different fights, some obviously professional matches from legitimate organizations, others with the grittier quality of underground tournaments. Men clustered around each screen, their conversations revealing knowledge of fighters, odds, and upcoming events that suggested deep involvement in the underground circuit. "Heard Silent Storm might be coming out of retirement." "Bullshit, she's been dead for decades. Torino's offering serious money for anyone who can confirm the rumors." Mabel forced herself to maintain her elderly shuffle while her mind processed the implications. Vincent wasn't just hunting her for revenge, he was using the legend of Silent Storm to generate interest in his tournaments. Her return would be the ultimate draw for high-stakes betting. "Grandma Rose, look at this!" Lena's excited voice drew Mabel toward a screen showing grainy footage of an underground match. "This fighter moves just like Grandpa always described." The footage was old, probably from the early 1990s, but the quality was good enough to show the combatants clearly. Mabel watched herself from 25 years ago, moving through combinations with the fluid precision that had earned her reputation. Seeing her younger self was disorienting. That woman had been so certain of her invincibility, so convinced that skill and training could overcome any challenge. "That's Silent Storm," said a man behind them watching the screen with the reverence of someone discussing a religious experience. His expensive suit and soft hands marked him as a spectator rather than a participant, but his knowledge seemed encyclopedic. "She was really that good?" Lena asked with perfectly pitched curiosity. "Undefeated in 18 professional matches," the man replied. "They called her Silent Storm because opponents never heard her coming. 1 second you were winning, the next you were unconscious, and she was walking away like nothing had happened." "What happened to her?" Mabel asked, playing the role of a grandmother trying to understand her granddaughter's interests. "Nobody knows for sure. Some say she got killed, some say she got married and retired. But Vincent Torino's been looking for her for almost 40 years, so she must have done something to really piss him off." The casual mention of Vincent's obsession confirmed what Mabel had suspected. Her disappearance had become part of underground fighting lore, the kind of mystery that accumulated details and speculation over decades of retelling. "Mr. Torino sounds like an important person," Lena said, with the breathless interest of a young woman impressed by power and danger. "He runs the biggest underground tournaments on the East Coast. Word is he's planning something special for next month. Big money, championship-level fighters, invitation only." The man leaned closer, clearly enjoying the attention of an attractive woman. "I heard he's even got Silent Storm's old teacher as a special guest." Mabel's hand tightened imperceptibly on her walking cane, but her expression remained pleasantly confused. "Her teacher?" "Lu Wei.
The old man who trained most of the Asian fighters back in the day. Torino's been trying to get him to cooperate for years. Finally found the right leverage, I guess." Before either woman could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. Tank Williams had arrived early, his massive frame cutting through the crowd like a ship through water. Even from across the room, Mabel could see the intelligence behind his brutish exterior. He was scanning faces, evaluating threats, cataloging anything that seemed out of place. "We need to go," Lena murmured, but Tank's attention had already focused on their section of the casino. "Not yet," Mabel replied quietly. "We haven't learned enough." Tank approached their group with the casual confidence of someone owning the space around him. His eyes lingered on Lena for a moment before dismissing her as harmless, then settled on Mabel with the puzzled expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "Evening, folks," he said, his voice carrying the forced friendliness of a bouncer trying to avoid unnecessary violence. "Having fun?" "Oh, yes," Mabel replied with elderly enthusiasm. "Amy here is teaching me about fighting. I never realized it was so complicated." Tank's attention returned to Lena, and Mabel saw the moment when his trained eye caught something that didn't fit. The way Lena stood, perhaps, or the unconscious awareness in her posture that marked her as someone with combat training. "You look familiar," Tank said to Lena, his tone shifting slightly. "You serve?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Lena's cover story hadn't included military service, but denying it now would only make Tank more suspicious. "Army," she said reluctantly. "2 deployments, nothing exciting." "What unit?" The interrogation was escalating rapidly, and Mabel knew they had seconds before their cover was completely blown. She let her cane slip from her arthritic fingers, the wooden shaft clattering against the floor with enough noise to draw Tank's attention. "Oh dear," she said, attempting to bend down to retrieve it, and instead stumbling slightly. The movement brought her within arm's reach of Tank, and she used the proximity to assess his stance, his balance, the way he carried his weight. Tank reflexively reached out to steady her, his protective instincts overriding his suspicion for just a moment. But as Mabel straightened, a drunk patron chose that exact moment to shove past them toward the bar, his shoulder catching Lena hard enough to send her stumbling. "Watch it, asshole!" Lena snapped as she caught the man's wrist with speed and precision that was definitely not civilian. The drunk patron, 3 drinks past rational thought, decided to escalate the situation by grabbing Lena inappropriately. What happened next lasted less than 3 seconds, but revealed everything Tank needed to know about the blonde woman's true capabilities. Lena's response was automatic, a joint lock that dropped the drunk to his knees, followed by enough pressure to make him release her immediately. Professional, efficient, and completely inconsistent with her cover story. Tank's suspicion crystallized into certainty. "Yeah, you're military, all right. Question is, what are you really doing here?" The time for deception had passed. Mabel straightened from her elderly shuffle, her hand finding the balance point on her cane as if it were a weapon rather than a mobility aid. "We're leaving," she said quietly, her voice carrying an authority that made Tank take an unconscious step backward. "I don't think so." Tank moved to block their path to the exit, his bulk effectively trapping them in the betting area. "I think Mr. Torino would be very interested in meeting you ladies." "Vincent's here?" Mabel asked, her tactile mind already calculating angles and escape routes. "He'll be." Tank reached for his phone with one hand while keeping his eyes on both women. "Soon as I tell him we've got some interesting visitors asking questions about Silent Storm." Mabel met Lena's eyes and saw the younger woman tense for action. Around them, other patrons were beginning to notice the confrontation, some moving away from potential violence while others leaned forward with the anticipation of entertainment. The Red Dog Casino had just become exponentially more dangerous, but they'd also learned something crucial. Vincent Torino wasn't just planning revenge, he was planning a spectacle, with Liwi as bait and Silent Storm as the main attraction. Now they just had to survive long enough to use that information. Tank's massive hand moved toward his phone with deliberate slowness, his eyes never leaving Mabel and Lena. Around them, the casino's atmosphere had shifted from casual entertainment to predatory anticipation. Other patrons sensed the change, some backing away while others pressed closer, drawn by the scent of violence. "Here's what's going to happen." Tank said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to intimidating people into compliance. You're going to sit down, order drinks, and wait quietly while I make a phone call. Anyone tries to leave, anyone makes a scene, and this gets very unpleasant very quickly. Mabel felt the familiar calm of tactical assessment settling over her like an old coat. 3 exits visible from their current position, but Tank's body language suggested backup was already positioning itself near the main entrance. Security cameras covering every angle, too many civilians in the potential line of fire. Or, she said quietly, you could just let 2 women leave peacefully and avoid explaining to Vincent why you started a riot in his money laundering operation.
Tank's eyes narrowed. Something in the older woman's tone was completely inconsistent with the frail grandmother act she'd been maintaining. The way she stood, the subtle shift in her posture, the complete absence of fear in her voice, all of it suggested someone far more dangerous than appearances indicated. "Lady, I don't know what game you're playing, but..." The lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in 3 seconds later, bathing the casino in red-tinged dimness that turned familiar surroundings into something alien and disorienting. The sudden darkness triggered exactly the kind of chaos Mabel had been hoping for. Shouts, the crash of overturned furniture, the electronic wailing of slot machines protesting the power interruption. "Jenny!" Lena whispered into her earpiece as they moved, using the confusion to put distance between themselves and Tank. "Tell me that was you." Transformer explosion 3 blocks away. Jenny's voice crackled through the tiny speaker. "Not planned, but I'll take it. You've got maybe 10 minutes before backup power kicks in fully." Mabel grabbed Lena's arm and pulled her toward what she hoped was a service corridor she'd spotted earlier. Tank's voice boomed over the chaos, organizing his people with military efficiency that suggested more training than his brutish appearance indicated. "Lock down all exits. Nobody leaves until the lights come back on." They moved through the darkness with careful speed, Mabel's memory of the casino's layout proving more accurate than she'd dared hope. The service corridor led toward the kitchen area, which should connect to loading docks and delivery entrances. Behind them, floodlight beams cut through the darkness as Tank's people began a systematic search. "This way," Mabel guided Lena through a maze of storage rooms and utility spaces, her confidence in the route growing with each correct turn. "Loading docks should be..." She stopped abruptly, her hand finding Lena's shoulder to halt the younger woman's forward movement. Voices ahead, positioning themselves at what was probably their intended exit. Tank's people were more professional than she'd given them credit for. "Back," she whispered, but even as they turned, more voices echoed from the direction they'd come. The net was tightening with uncomfortable efficiency. "Window," Lena pointed toward a narrow opening high on the wall, barely wide enough for a person, but leading to what looked like an alley. "I can boost you up." "You first," Mabel replied. "I'll follow." "No way, you're the one they really want." The argument was settled by the sound of approaching footsteps. Lena interlaced her fingers to form a step, and Mabel used it to reach the window with an agility that would have surprised her children. The opening was tight, but 37 years of yoga classes had maintained more flexibility than most people her age possessed. She dropped into the alley with practiced silence, then positioned herself to help Lena make the same escape. But as the younger woman's feet touched the ground, the service door they'd been heading for burst open, spilling armed men into the space they had just vacated. "They're gone," someone reported. "Windows open. They're in the alley." Mabel and Lena ran.
This wasn't just another fight to these people. It was mythology made manifest, legend colliding with legacy in a space designed for maximum spectacle. "You're not my daughter," Mabel said quietly, circling to her left while keeping her eyes on Maria's hands. "I don't know what he's told you, but whatever grievance Vincent has with me doesn't extend to you." Maria's laugh was soft and utterly without humor. "He told me about you. How you killed my brother, how you destroyed our family, and disappeared like a coward when the consequences caught up with you." The accusation hit like a physical blow. Mabel's step faltered for just an instant before training reasserted itself. "Your brother?" "Tommy Chen." Maria's voice carried the weight of 37 years of carefully cultivated hatred. "The young man you murdered in 1987 to protect your perfect record." The lie was so complete,
so perfectly crafted that Mabel almost admired its sophistication. Vincent had taken the truth, Tommy Chen's murder at his own hands, and inverted it into something that would fuel his daughter's training for decades. Not just revenge, but righteous vengeance against the child killer who'd escaped justice. Tommy Chen was murdered, Mabel agreed, her voice steady despite the horror of understanding what Vincent had done. But not by me. By your father. I was the witness who saw it happen. Liar. Maria's response was immediate, automatic, the kind of certainty that came from a lifetime of conditioning. You killed him because he was about to expose you as a fraud. Father showed me the footage. Footage. Of course, Vincent would have prepared evidence to support his narrative. Doctored recordings, edited sequences, testimony from people who'd been bought or intimidated into corroborating his version of events. He'd built Maria's entire identity around a lie so fundamental that questioning it would require her to dismantle everything she believed about herself. "What footage did he show you?" Mabel asked, still circling, still evaluating. Maria was good, better than good. Her technique was flawless, her conditioning obvious, her tactical awareness sharp enough to suggest real combat experience rather than just gymnasium training. "You're good," Maria acknowledged, resetting her stance, "but not good enough to escape what you did." "I didn't kill your brother," Mabel said again, this time with absolute conviction. "And deep down, you know that. Your father has spent 37 years preparing you for this moment, but he never explained why it took him so long to find me, did he?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed Maria's features before being quickly suppressed. "Because you were hiding. Because I was living openly under my real name in a small town 60 miles away. I've been Mabel Anderson for decades. I volunteer at the library, I raise 2 children, I pay taxes, and vote in local elections. If Vincent wanted revenge, he could have found me any time he chose." The truth of that statement was undeniable, and Mabel saw it register in Maria's eyes. Someone with Vincent's resources wouldn't need 37 years to locate a librarian living under her legal name. "So why now?" Mabel pressed, dodging another attack sequence and responding with enough force to make Maria respect her capabilities. "Because," Maria's response was cut off by her own realization. The timing, the elaborate setup, the years of preparation, none of it made sense if Vincent's only goal was simple revenge. "Because he needed you to believe I was a monster. Because the truth would have made you question everything else he taught you. Because his real enemy was never me. It was his own guilt." The psychological warfare was having its intended effect. Maria's attacks were becoming less precise, her combinations betraying the confusion that was undermining her certainty. But she was still dangerous, still operating on decades of muscle memory that didn't require conscious thought to be lethal. Across the warehouse, Mabel caught a glimpse of movement near where Liu Wei was being held. Her teacher had managed to free one of his restraints and was working on the second, his movements so subtle that his guards hadn't noticed. But time was shortening. Vincent was too experienced not to recognize when a psychological gambit was working, and he'd intervene before his carefully constructed narrative completely collapsed. "The footage he showed you, did it show Tommy's face when he died? Did it show him begging for his life?" "Stop." Maria's voice cracked slightly. "Because that's what I remember. Tommy Chen begging your father to reconsider, promising he'd cooperate, promising he'd throw the match, promising anything that might save his life. But Vincent had already made his decision." "Stop!" Maria's shout echoed through the warehouse, her composure finally fracturing under the weight of doubt. That moment of emotional vulnerability was what Mabel had been waiting for. Not to attack, that would only validate Vincent's narrative about her character, but to offer something Maria had probably never experienced from an opponent: mercy. Instead of pressing her advantage, Mabel stepped back and lowered her hands. The gesture was so unexpected that the crowd fell silent, confused by the absence of violence they'd paid to witness.
But Vincent Torino understood exactly what was happening. His carefully orchestrated revenge was collapsing not because of superior force, but because of superior character. Silent Storm wasn't just refusing to play his game. She was exposing its fundamental cruelty. "Enough talk," he shouted, his composure finally cracking after decades of patient planning. "If she won't fight properly, then we'll settle this the old-fashioned way." The gun appeared in his hand with practiced speed, its barrel trained on Liu Wei rather than Mabel. The implicit threat was clear: continue the charade of combat, or watch an innocent man die for her principles. "Now we see who you really are," Vincent called out, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who believed he'd finally cornered his quarry. "Fight my daughter, or your teacher dies." The crowd fell silent, sensing that the evening's entertainment had taken a darker turn. This wasn't sport anymore. It was execution with extra steps. But Mabel had spent 37 years preparing for this exact moment, even if she hadn't realized it at the time. Every day of quiet discipline, every year of choosing peace over violence, every decision to build rather than destroy had been leading to this test of who she really was. "You want to know who I am?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly through the warehouse. "I'm someone who spent 37 years learning that true strength isn't about winning fights. It's about choosing not to fight when fighting would make you into something monstrous." She turned to face Maria, who stood frozen in the center of the ring, her entire worldview collapsing around her. "But I'm also someone who will do whatever is necessary to protect people I care about, even if that means becoming the monster your father wants me to be." The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The patient librarian disappeared, replaced by something that had earned the name Silent Storm through 18 consecutive victories in environments where losing meant more than embarrassment. Maria saw the change and finally understood what her father had been hunting for 37 years. Not a coward or a killer, but something far more dangerous. Someone who chose to be gentle but retained the capacity for absolute violence when gentleness wasn't enough. The final confrontation was about to begin, but the rules had changed. This wasn't about Vincent's revenge or Maria's conditioning anymore. It was about who Mabel Anderson really was when everything she cared about was threatened. And that person, she was beginning to remember, had never learned how to lose. The gun in Vincent's hand was steady, professional, aimed with the casual precision of someone who'd used firearms to solve problems for decades. Around the warehouse, the crowd had fallen into an unnatural silence, their bloodlust satisfied by the promise of actual death rather than mere sport. But Mabel wasn't looking at Vincent or his weapon. Her attention was focused on Liu Wei, who had managed to free both hands and was now working on the rope around his ankles with movements so subtle that they were nearly invisible. 37 years of separation hadn't dulled their ability to communicate without words, a skill developed through countless training sessions where survival depended on reading intention in the smallest gesture. Liu Wei's eyes flicked toward the support beam directly above Vincent's position, then back to Mabel. A message passed between teacher and student, refined by decades of shared understanding about timing, leverage, and the precise application of force.
3 men entered, their bulk incongruous among the delicate teacups and silk scrolls that decorated his shop. The largest one, built like a professional wrestler with scars marking his knuckles, let his eyes roam the space with predatory assessment. "You Lu Wei?" the big man asked, his voice carrying the particular flatness of someone accustomed to intimidation. "I am." Lu Wei straightened to his full height, which barely reached the man's shoulders. "How may I help you?" "Name's Tank Williams. We need to talk." Lu Wei recognized the type immediately, muscled for hire. Dangerous, but lacking the intelligence to be truly unpredictable. The 2 men flanking him carried themselves with similar brutish confidence, but their eyes held the twitchy alertness of users rather than professionals. "My shop is open to all who come in peace," Lu Wei said formally. What kind of tea interests you? Tank's laugh was harsh and humorless. The kind that tells me where to find Silent Storm. The name hit like a physical blow, though Lu Wei's expression didn't change. He'd spent 37 years expecting this conversation, preparing for the day when his past and hers would collide with present reality. I'm afraid I don't understand, he said quietly. Sure you don't. Tank stepped closer, his massive frame casting a shadow across the tea display. Vincent Torino sends his regards, by the way. Says to tell you he's got a long memory and lots of patience. Vincent Torino. Lu Wei remembered the young man who'd inherited his father's criminal empire and brought it into the underground fighting world with ruthless efficiency. The same man who'd corrupted what should have been pure competition with threats, fixed matches, and ultimately murder. Mr. Torino and I have no business together, Lu Wei said. That's where you're wrong, old man. Tank's hand shot out with surprising speed, gripping Lu Wei's wrist in a crushing hold. You trained her, you know where she is, and you're gonna help us have a little reunion. Lu Wei tested the grip with saw pressure, feeling the strength behind it. These men could overpower him easily, but they'd underestimated what 30 decades of preparation could accomplish. He'd always known this day might come. I trained many students over the years, he said calmly. Perhaps if you were more specific? Tank's grip tightened until bone ground against bone. Don't fuck with me. Silent Storm, your little prodigy who cost Mr. Torino a lot of money and reputation when she vanished into thin air. Ring any bells? I remember a young woman named Mabel, Lu Wei said carefully. But she married, had children, lives a quiet life now. Not the person you're looking for. See, that's where you're wrong, again. Tank released his wrist and stepped back, gesturing to his companions. Tony, start breaking things, quietly. One of the men began systematically destroying Lu Wei's carefully arranged display, porcelain shattering with soft crashes that wouldn't carry to the street. 30 years of building this peaceful space, reduced to fragments in seconds. Stop! Lu Wei's voice carried command authority that made all three men pause. What do you want? Simple. You're going to make a phone call. Tell Silent Storm that old friends want to catch up. Set up a meeting. And if I refuse? Tank smiled with genuine pleasure. Then we keep breaking things. Your shop, your bones, whatever it takes. But either way, you're coming with us. Insurance, you might say. Lu Wei looked around his shop, seeing not just the destruction but the violation of the sanctuary he'd spent decades creating. These men understood nothing of honor or respect, only the crude application of force. They were exactly the kind of corruption that had driven him to leave the fighting world behind. I'll need to close the shop properly, he said finally. Tony'll help you with that. Tank nodded toward the man who'd been destroying the tea display. Real helpful guy, Tony. Knows all about closing shops. As Lu Wei moved toward his cash register, his fingers brushed against the small panic button hidden beneath the counter. But he didn't press it. The police would ask questions he couldn't answer, would involve authorities in matters that belonged to a world they couldn't understand. This was between the people who remembered when Silent Storm had been more than a librarian's secret. Don't try anything cute, Tank warned, but Lu Wei was already moving with careful cooperation, his hands visible and steady. He locked the register, turned off the lights, and flipped the sign in his window from open to closed. As they escorted him toward a black SUV parked outside, he caught sight of his reflection in the shop's window, an old man being led away by thugs. But his expression was calm, almost serene. He'd been Mabel's teacher once.
Now it was time to see how well his lessons had taken root. Back at the library. "You've got 2 hours to think about it," the voice on the phone continued. 2 hours to remember that some debts don't disappear just because you change your name and learn the Dewey Decimal System. "I don't know who you think I am," Mabel said, but the words felt hollow even to her. "Vincent Torino knows exactly who you are. He's known for years, just been waiting for the right moment. See, finding you was never the problem. The problem was making sure you'd care enough to show up." "Show up where?" "I'll call back with details. 2 hours, Silent Storm. Don't disappoint us." The line went dead. Mabel sat holding the silent receiver, her mind racing through possibilities and plans with the tactical awareness she'd spent decades suppressing. Around her, the library continued its peaceful routine, but she was no longer part of that world. She was back in a place where strength mattered more than kindness, where hesitation could mean death. She dialed Lu Wei's shop from memory, a number she'd memorized but never called. The phone rang 6 times before rolling to voicemail. His familiar voice, speaking in both English and Mandarin, invited callers to leave a message. She hung up without speaking. There was no such thing as coincidence in the world she'd left behind. If Vincent Torino had found her, if he'd connected her to Lu Wei, then the old man was already gone. The only question was whether he was still alive. Mabel looked around the library, at Mrs. Patterson, arranging books with loving care, at the teenagers clustered around computers, at the young mother reading softly to her toddler in the children's section. This was the world she'd chosen, the life she'd built through 37 years of careful invisibility. But Master Lu Wei had given her more than fighting skills. He'd taught her about duty, about the obligations that came with strength, about the bonds between teacher and student that transcended time and circumstance. She picked up the phone and dialed Lu Wei's shop from memory. The phone rang 6 times before rolling to voicemail. His familiar voice, speaking in both English and Mandarin, invited callers to leave a message. She hung up without speaking. There was no such thing as coincidence in the world she'd left behind. If Vincent Torino had found her, if he'd connected her to Lu Wei, then the old man was already gone. The only question was whether he was still alive. Mabel looked around the library, at Mrs. Patterson arranging books with loving care, at the teenagers clustered around computers, at the young mother reading softly to her toddler in the children's section. This was the world she'd chosen, the life she'd built through 37 years of careful invisibility. But Master Lu Wei had given her more than fighting skills. He'd taught her about duty, about the obligations that came with strength, about the bonds between teacher and student that transcended time and circumstance. She picked up the phone and dialed the library's main office. "This is Mabel at the reference desk. I need to take the rest of the day off. Family emergency." The lie came easily, though it wasn't really a lie. Lu Wei was more family than her own children had proven to be. He'd seen her potential when she was just a frightened teenager, had shaped her into something formidable and beautiful and dangerous. Now someone had taken him because of what she used to be. Silent Storm had been sleeping for 37 years, but some people, she was beginning to remember, should never be awakened. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave the library, Mabel felt the familiar weight of tactical assessment settling over her like an old coat. Exits, sight lines, potential weapons, escape routes. The training Lu Wei had drilled into her until it became instinct. Somewhere in the city, Vincent Torino was waiting for her to remember who she used to be. He had no idea what he'd just set in motion. The librarian was going home.
"You have 10 seconds to decide," Vincent called out. his voice carrying the theatrical authority of someone who believed he controlled every variable in the equation. Fight my daughter properly, or watch an old man die for your stubbornness. Father, don't. Maria's voice cracked with the strain of watching her worldview collapse in real time. This isn't what you taught me. This isn't honor. Honor? Vincent's laugh was harsh, brittle with 37 years of accumulated bitterness. She killed your brother and walked away without consequences. There's no honor in letting monsters escape justice. But even as he spoke, doubt was creeping into his voice. Maria's questioning had forced him to confront the inconsistencies in his own narrative, the logical gaps he'd spent decades refusing to examine. Why had he waited so long? Why had he needed his daughter to be his instrument of revenge, rather than acting himself? 5 seconds, he announced, but the gun wavered slightly as his certainty faltered. Mabel moved, not toward Vincent or the weapon, but laterally, positioning herself with the spatial awareness that had once made her legendary in fighting circles. Every step was calculated, every movement designed to create the precise geometry necessary for what Li Wei was planning. "Stop," Vincent shouted, swinging the gun toward her. "Don't move another—" Li Wei struck. The rope he'd been working on wasn't just his restraint. It was part of a pulley system that controlled one of the overhead lights illuminating the makeshift arena. When he yanked it free, a massive floodlight fixture dropped like a guided missile toward Vincent's position. But Vincent's reflexes were still sharp, honed by decades of violence and survival. He dove sideways, avoiding the crushing impact by inches, rolling to his feet with the gun still in his hand and his eyes blazing with fury. "Clever," he snarled, training the weapon on Li Wei again, but not clever enough. That's when Lena struck from behind. She'd been moving through the crowd during the confrontation, using the spectators' focus on the drama in the ring to position herself for exactly this moment. The knife that had been concealed against her thigh found the gap between Vincent's ribs with surgical precision. Not fatal, but debilitating enough to make him drop the gun and stagger backward. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Vincent's security people reached for their weapons while the crowd scattered in every direction. Their entertainment suddenly transformed into a live fire situation. Shouts echoed off the metal walls as people sought cover behind whatever structures were available. But Mabel was already moving, her body operating on 37 years of suppressed muscle memory. She reached Vincent before he could recover his weapon, her hands finding the pressure points that would drop him without permanent damage. He collapsed, conscious, but unable to coordinate his movements, his eyes wide with the shock of being defeated by someone he'd underestimated for decades. "Tank." Vincent's voice was weak, but still carried authority. "Kill them all." Across the warehouse, Tank Williams struggled to his feet, still groggy from his earlier defeat, but loyal enough to respond to his employer's command. He reached for the backup weapon concealed in his jacket, his massive frame shielding the movement from most observers. But Maria was closer. The young woman who'd spent her entire life training to defeat Silent Storm found herself facing a different choice entirely. Tank's gun was rising toward the woman she'd been conditioned to hate, and Maria had perhaps 2 seconds to decide who she really was. The decision came without conscious thought. 26 years of martial arts training compressed into a single, perfect strike that dropped Tank before he could fire a shot. Her father's enforcer hit the concrete floor like a felled tree, the weapon spinning away across the rough surface. "Maria!" Vincent's voice was horrified, disbelieving. "What have you done?" "What I should have done years ago," Maria replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what had just happened. "I stopped listening to your lies." Around them, the chaos was beginning to subside as people realized the immediate violence had ended. Some spectators were fleeing toward the exits, while others lingered to see how the drama would resolve.
Vincent's remaining security people found themselves facing an impossible tactical situation. Their boss was down, their primary enforcer was unconscious, and the people they'd been hired to control had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything in their job description. "Stand down," Lena called out, her military authority cutting through the confusion. "This is over." "Jenny," Mabel said into her earpiece, helping Leo Wei to his feet and checking him for serious injuries. "We need extraction. Are the police already en route? Anonymous tip about illegal gambling and firearms violations. ETA 3 minutes." Leo Wei leaned heavily on Mabel's arm, his 73-year-old body protesting the evening's abuse. But his eyes were bright with satisfaction, and when he spoke, his voice carried the approval of a teacher whose student had exceeded all expectations. "You remembered," he said quietly. "I remembered that violence is a tool, not a solution. I remembered that strength without wisdom is just brutality. I remembered what you taught me about choosing when to fight and when to walk away. And you chose correctly." Across the warehouse floor, Vincent struggled to sit up, his face contorted with rage and disbelief. Everything he had planned, everything he had prepared for, had collapsed not because he'd been overpowered, but because he'd been outthought. "This isn't over," he snarled. "You think you've won something? I'll find you again. "No," Maria said quietly, kneeling beside her father with an expression of profound sadness. "You won't." She reached into her jacket and withdrew a small recording device, its red light indicating it had been active throughout the evening's events. "Everything you said tonight about Tommy Chen, about why you've been hunting Silent Storm, about using me as your instrument of revenge against the woman who witnessed your crime, it's all recorded. The police will be very interested in a confession to a 37-year-old murder." Vincent's face went pale as he realized the full scope of his daughter's betrayal, not just of his plans, but of everything he taught her to believe about loyalty and family. "You're my daughter." "Yes, and I'm also Tommy Chen's sister. His real sister, the one you stole from his family when he was murdered, the one you raised to be your instrument of revenge against the woman who witnessed your crime." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Mabel stared at Maria with dawning understanding, seeing features that she initially attributed to Vincent, but that actually belonged to the young man who died in 1987. Not Vincent's daughter at all, but Tommy's sister, kidnapped and brainwashed to become the perfect weapon against her brother's witness. "You knew," Mabel said, not a question, but a statement of fact. "I've suspected for years," Maria replied. "Little inconsistencies in the story, gaps in my early memories, the way certain subjects made Father nervous. But I needed to hear him confess before I could be certain." Police sirens were audible now, growing closer with each passing second. Around the warehouse, Vincent's people were making their own calculations about loyalty versus self-preservation, and most were choosing to disappear into the night rather than face questions about their involvement in kidnapping and illegal gambling operations. "Stand down," Lena called out, her military authority cutting through the confusion. "This is over." "Jenny," Mabel said into her earpiece, helping Leo Wei to his feet and checking him for serious injuries. "We need extraction. Are the police already en route? Anonymous tip about illegal gambling and firearms violations. ETA 3 minutes. Leo Wei leaned heavily on Mabel's arm, his 73-year-old body protesting the evening's abuse. But his eyes were bright with satisfaction, and when he spoke, his voice carried the approval of a teacher whose student had exceeded all expectations. "You remembered?" "I remembered that violence is a tool, not a solution. I remembered that strength without wisdom is just brutality. I remembered what you taught me about choosing when to fight and when to walk away. And you chose correctly." Across the warehouse floor, Vincent struggled to sit up, his face contorted with rage and disbelief. Everything he had planned, everything he had prepared for, had collapsed not because he'd been overpowered, but because he'd been outthought. "This isn't over," he snarled. "You think you've won something? I'll find you again. No, Maria said quietly, kneeling beside her father with an expression of profound sadness. You won't. She reached into her jacket and withdrew a small recording device, its red light indicating it had been active throughout the evening's events. Everything you said tonight about Tommy Chen, about why you've been hunting Silent Storm, about using me as your instrument of revenge against the woman who witnessed your crime, it's all recorded. The police will be very interested in a confession to a 37-year-old murder." Vincent's face went pale as he realized the full scope of his daughter's betrayal, not just of his plans, but of everything he taught her to believe about loyalty and family. "You're my daughter." "Yes, and I'm also Tommy Chen's sister."
Mabel considered the question with the same care she'd once used to evaluate opponents. All of it was real. Being your mother was never part of some cover stories, Sarah. It was the most important role I ever played, and I played it honestly. But you were hiding who you used to be. I was protecting you from who I used to be. There's a difference. Mabel's voice carried the patient authority of someone who'd had 2 weeks to think through these exact questions. Silent Storm was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with her fighting skills. She was connected to people who solved problems with violence, who measured success in other people's pain. I wanted to give you a better world than that. Lu Wei set down his tea and leaned forward slightly, his teacher's instincts engaging with the family dynamics he was witnessing. Your mother made a choice that required tremendous sacrifice. She walked away from everything that made her feel powerful and alive because she understood that some prices are too high to pay. And now? David asked, his tone suggesting this was the question that had been keeping him awake at night. What happens now that the secret's out? What happens to the life you built? Now I get to choose who I want to be going forward. Not Silent Storm, not just Mabel the librarian, but someone who incorporates the best parts of both identities. The conversation was interrupted by the doorbell. Through the front window, Mabel could see a familiar figure on her porch, Detective Rivera, the lead investigator on the Torino case, holding what looked like an official envelope. "Mrs. Anderson? Sorry to interrupt your Sunday afternoon. I have some paperwork for you to sign, and I thought you might want to know that Vincent Torino officially pled guilty to the 1987 murder of Tommy Chen this morning." The news settled over the room like a weight being lifted. 37 years of looking over her shoulder, 37 years of carefully constructed normalcy designed to avoid drawing attention had finally come to an end. "What about Maria?" Mabel asked. "She's working with the FBI to identify other victims of her father's organization. Turns out kidnapping and brainwashing children wasn't a one-time thing for Vincent." Detective Rivera's expression was grim. "She's also been cleared of any wrongdoing in connection with the warehouse incident, self-defense and protection of others." After the detective left, the family sat in contemplative silence for several minutes. The legal resolution felt anticlimactic after everything they'd been through, but it also provided the kind of closure that allowed for moving forward rather than simply surviving. "So what's next?" Jenny asked, breaking the silence with characteristic directness. "You've got skills that most martial arts instructors would kill for, no pun intended. The community center could use someone with your expertise teaching advanced classes." "I've been thinking about that," Mabel replied. "Lu Wei and I have been discussing opening a proper school, something that teaches real martial arts, not just forms and fitness, but philosophy and discipline, and the responsibility that comes with knowing how to fight." Lu Wei nodded approvingly. "The Golden Dragon Tea Shop has space upstairs that could be converted into a studio. Small classes, carefully selected students, emphasis on character development as much as technical skill." "You'd really want to partner with me after everything that's happened? Especially after everything that happened. You proved that my teaching took root, that the principles I'd tried to instill survived 37 years of dormancy. What better qualification could there be for helping me pass those lessons to a new generation?"
Lena looked up from the newspaper clippings she'd been studying. If you're looking for students, I'd like to continue training, properly this time. Not just recreational classes, but serious study. What about college? Your GI Bill benefits won't last forever. State University has a criminal justice program that would complement martial arts training nicely. I'm thinking about law enforcement, maybe federal work. Turns out I have a talent for dealing with situations that fall outside normal parameters. Sarah cleared her throat hesitantly. Would you consider teaching me? I know I'm not young or particularly athletic, but after watching what you did, after seeing how you handled yourself in that situation, you want to learn martial arts? David's surprise was evident. I want to learn how to be strong the way Mom is strong, how to be confident without being aggressive, how to protect people without becoming someone scary. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she spoke. I work with domestic violence victims, with people who've been hurt by others. Maybe understanding how to fight would help me understand how to help them feel safe. Mabel felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was clenched tight. Her daughter's request represented something she'd never dared hope for. Acceptance not just of who she used to be, but of who she might become. I'd be honored to teach you, she said simply. David shifted in his chair, his discomfort obvious. I still don't understand how you kept this secret for so long, how you managed to be completely different people in the same life. I wasn't different people. I was the same person making different choices based on different circumstances. Silent Storb and Mabel Anderson both believe in protecting others, in using strength responsibly, and in choosing peace when possible and action when necessary. The only difference was how those beliefs got expressed. And the fighting? The violence? Mabel considered her answer carefully, knowing that David's acceptance would require complete honesty about aspects of herself that she'd kept hidden for decades. Violence is a tool, like a scalpel or a gun or a car. It can save lives or destroy them, depending on who's using it and why. I learned to use it precisely, reluctantly, and only when other options had been exhausted. That's something I'm not ashamed of. It's something I'm proud of. The conversation continued as afternoon faded toward evening, touching on practical matters like schedules and legal considerations, but also on deeper questions about identity, family, and the masks people wore to protect themselves and others. By the time Liu Wei and the others prepared to leave, something fundamental had shifted in the family dynamic.